Okay, so this next video lecture is the continuation of our module 14. So this time we will be discussing the topic about the audit uh, procedures to be applied on the samples chosen for the test of control. So in this case, the auditor should make sure that he applies an appropriate audit procedure in examining the samples that he has chosen. So the samples, if you could still remember in our previous video lecture, this comes from the use, okay, of those different uh, sampling technique, okay, depending on the choice of the auditor, okay, to determine the number of samples to be taken from the entire population. So the point here is that the auditor should select an appropriate audit procedure in evaluating such samples. Okay, so we have here an example. Okay, in the case of voided check, okay, meaning these are checks that were drawn and then later on it was voided, or these checks were cancelled, okay, and this cannot be processed further to be paid for the payee and for encashment. So if this is the item that is selected for testing, the evidence of payment authorization, so in this case the auditor will not consider this voiding of check to be a deviation if this has gone into a properly uh, uh, if this voiding of check has gone to a proper process, okay, meaning there has been an acceptable and appropriate reason why these checks are voided. Okay, but if, for example, the auditor has found out that voiding of checks was not uh, authorized, or if these checks were voided because it has um, some uh, anomaly, okay, that might be involved, then in that case, the auditor shall consider it as a deviation. Okay. So consequently, the auditor should perform the procedure on the appropriately chosen replacement item. So for example, if the auditor is not satisfied, okay, then he has to take another sample, okay, for evaluation. Okay, but in this case, he has also to make sure that he applied an appropriate procedure for evaluating such item. Okay, for example, or in this case, if the auditor is unable to perform the planned audit procedures in the selected item, because, for example, the item has been lost or it was destroyed, so meaning there is no audit trail where the auditor can get uh, audit evidence. But also, please take note that in this case, there is no audit trail and there is no uh, alternative procedures, meaning the auditor has uh, no choice, or he has uh, not, or he has no other options to get the audit evidence. So in this instance, this is what he shall consider to be a deviation, okay, from the prescribed control in testing for the test of controls. Okay, so because in this case, there is no documentation, but it has been recorded, or it has been part of the amount, okay, of the balance in the transaction, but it has no documentation or audit trail. So in this case, the auditor will consider it as a deviation. For in the case of substantive test of details, this will also be considered as a misstatement. Okay, so that's how the auditor treats, okay, these types of instances for his selected item, which is he evaluates in gathering the audit evidences. Okay, so we have here the following procedures in evaluating sample results for the test of controls. Okay, so what are the procedures, okay, to evaluate the sample results? First, if there is already the result, okay, of the evaluation of the samples, the auditor will calculate the sample deviation rate, or the auditor's estimate of the true but unknown population deviation rate. Because in this case, sample deviation rate will determine, okay, the amount as well of the estimated rate of misstatement, okay, taken, or that is taken from the sample. Because uh, as we have mentioned before, whatever the result of the evaluation of the sample is, this will be inferred, okay, to the population as well. So meaning whatever the result of the sample is, that will also be the same result for if the auditor has evaluated the entire population. Okay, so that's why the auditor shall calculate the sample deviation rate. Okay. So another, aside from the sample deviation rate, the auditor should also determine the maximum population deviation. Okay, so normally this is the upper deviation or occurrence limit, or this is also known as the achieved upper precision limit. Because in this case, this will be compared also with the sample deviation rate. Maximum population deviation rate is this is the upper limit, okay, of the deviation in such or in a particular population where the samples were taken. Okay, so after which the auditor will compare the maximum population deviation rate with our tolerable deviation rate, okay, that is specified in the sample. Okay, so as we go along, we will discuss why this will be compared in the interpretation, okay, if there are any difference between this maximum population deviation rate and our tolerable deviation rate. So tolerable meaning this is the lowest acceptable deviation rate, okay, for a certain sample or population. Okay, maximum population deviation, this is somewhat the close to the actual deviation in the population, okay, that exists there. Okay, so as our next, after comparing such, if there is any difference between the maximum population deviation rate and our tolerable deviation rate, the auditor will consider the qualitative aspects of the occurrence of these deviations. So he has not only considered the numbers that is presented out of the assessment, but he has to go through the reasons why these deviations have occurred as well. Okay, so the auditor should investigate the nature, whether this deviation is intentional or unintentional, and what are the causes of these deviations. He also has to evaluate the possible effect, okay, of these deviations on the audit procedure as well as on the other areas of the audit. Okay, so probably there might be some effect, okay, on the other parts of the financial statements or as well as in his other audit procedures. Next, when the auditor considers a deviation that he discovered in the sample to be an anomaly, meaning there is something, there is doubt, or probably the auditor um, considers fraud that exists, okay, or fraud as one of the reasons why deviations have occurred, then in this case, the auditor should obtain a high degree of certainty that such deviation is not representative, meaning this is just to make sure that this is just in the selected item and not applicable to the whole population, or else if this is or if this deviation, which involves anomaly, represents the whole population, then the effect of this is the auditor will increase his substantive procedure to gather more evidence to detect more misstatement. Okay, so that is the effect. That's why in this case, in order for him uh, to continue to follow his planned audit procedures, he has to obtain a high degree of certainty. But he has also to perform additional, okay, this one. The auditor should consider performing additional audit procedure, okay, to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence that this deviation does not affect the remainder of the population. So still he has to perform additional audit procedure for such. Okay. What about for reaching a conclusion? Okay. So in this case, this is where we will interpret the difference between our deviations, okay, that the auditor has estimated and determined earlier. So the auditor should evaluate the sample results to determine whether the preliminary assessment of the relevant characteristics of the population is confirmed or it needs to be revised, okay, so that he will be able to conclude and infer the results from the sample to the entire population. So if the maximum population deviation rate, okay, is greater than the tolerable deviation rate, what does this mean? Meaning, it indicates higher risk of material misstatement. Because in this case, for example, tolerable deviation rate or acceptable deviation rate is only 20%. But upon determining of the auditor in the population deviation rate is 30%. Okay, so meaning there is indeed high risk of material misstatement. So what will happen? In this case, the auditor will increase his planned level of control risk, meaning to say he has to revise the control risk that is preliminarily determined. He shall increase the control risk. Okay, and if that is the case, if the control risk is high, what will happen? The auditor will increase the scope of his substantive procedure to detect more misstatement. Okay, so that's the effect of that. What about if the case is the opposite, where in this case, maximum population deviation rate is lower than the tolerable rate? Okay, for example, again, our tolerable rate is 20%, but upon the determination of the auditor of the population deviation rate, it's only 15%. So meaning, there is lower risk of material misstatement. So what will happen? The auditor should accept the sample result, okay, because it supports the planned assessed level of control risk, as well as the scope of his substantive procedures will not be modified. So this is where the sample results are accepted. For the first instance, where a maximum deviation rate is greater than the tolerable rate, then sample results is not totally accepted, but the auditor has to increase the samples to detect more misstatement. So that's how it is done. Okay, so this is how the auditor will obtain sufficient audit evidences to support his audit opinion in the case of samples for the test of controls. Okay, so we will continue with the next topic. So this is procedures to evaluate sample results for test of controls. In the first item, we discussed about the procedures, okay, for the result of the sample. Okay, so applied procedures applied in the sample chosen. This time, procedures to evaluate the sample results for test of controls. Okay, so this is somewhat related. Okay, Actually, this is just the application of what we have discussed, okay, in the first part. So we have here an illustration for us to understand better how procedures to evaluate sample results for test of controls are uh, performed. Okay, so we have here an illustration. For example, we have here the information, given information, and then um, this will be used to evaluate the sample results, okay, of that for the test of controls. So here, our allowable risk of assessing control risk too low is 5%. Tolerable deviation rate is 6%. Expected population deviation rate is 2.5. So meaning in this case, tolerable deviation rate is greater than the population deviation rate. So it indicates that there is low risk of misstatement. That's why the risk in the control risk is assessed as low as well. Okay. So in this case, the auditor discovered 6 deviations while examining the samples. Okay. So we have here the table. Okay, this is the table where we can determine, okay, the number of samples. I don't know if we can extend this one so that you will be able to see it clearly. Okay. Okay. So here, this is the table. Statistical sample size for test of controls. So this is for the 5% risk of over-reliance or control risk too low, in other words. Okay, with a number of expected errors in the parentheses. Okay, so here, in using the table, we have here the columns and the rows. For the columns, this is for the tolerable deviation rate. Okay, in the previous example, our tolerable deviation rate is at 6%. So to use the table, we will select, okay, from this column right here. This is 6%. Okay, and then in our row, uh, is the expected deviation rate. Okay, so expected deviation rate is at 2.5. Okay, that's why we will select, okay, from this row, okay, for 2.5. So meaning in this case, with 6% tolerable deviation rate and with 2.5 expected deviation rate, meaning the samples is 150. Okay, so this is how we use this table, okay, for the statistical sample size. Okay, so here the sample size must consist of 150 units as shown in the table, but normally in the real practice, these rates will be determined after the determination of the sample size. Okay, as we discussed before, the proper order is that the auditor should first identify the sample size. But for example, if um, in this example, however, that where we have taken our reference, okay, these rates are already given. So meaning with these types of rates, using this table, okay, so the auditor used the sample size of 150 units. Okay, so since the auditor, okay, so to continue, since the auditor discovered 6 deviation, so how to determine or computed sample deviation rate. Okay, so this is what we have mentioned in the procedures, right? You could still remember. So our formula for the sample deviation rate is number of deviations observed divided by the sample size. So based on our given data, so there are 6 deviations, And then, based on the table, we have determined that the sample size is 150. So the sample deviation rate, therefore, is 4%. Okay? So that's how it is determined. Okay, next. Based on a 5% risk of assessing risk too low and with 6 deviations found, the maximum population deviation rate can be determined using the table. Okay, so if you could still remember in our audit procedures to be applied, so first the auditor will determine the sample deviation rate, and then after which he has to determine the uh, maximum population deviation rate. So how to determine such? Okay, so we also have here the table. So this table is, you will just expand it so that you can have a better view. Okay, so this table is a statistical sampling results evaluation table for tests of controls with 5% risk of over-reliance or control risk too low. So just like in the first table, we have the columns and our row. Okay, so in this case, our column is the actual number of deviations found. So we will get it from the sixth column because based on the illustration, there were 6 deviations found by the auditor during the evaluation. And then for the row, what is the sample size? Okay, so we have determined the sample size as 150. So meaning the rate here, maximum population deviation rate is 7.8. Okay, but okay, so that is 7.8. Okay, as shown in the table. So what we will do next, or the auditor will do next, is okay, to determine the allowance for sampling risk, because actually we also have the formula for maximum population deviation rate. This is the sum of sample deviation rate plus the allowable or allowance for sampling risk. So we determined already the maximum population deviation rate from the table, okay, using the number of deviations and the number of sample or sample size. So from the table, it's 7.8. So all we have to do is to deduct the sample deviation rate that we determined earlier, which is 4%. So meaning the sampling risk or allowance for sampling risk is 3.8. Okay, so that's how it is determined. Okay, so based on the sample results, there is 5% chance that the true population deviation rate are greater than or equal to 7.8, because in this case there is 5% risk of over reliance of or in the internal control. Okay, so but all of these are just hypothetical. Okay, so this is how it is done. But again, for the proper order, so the auditor should first determine the number of sample size, and then from there he will evaluate the samples or the items from the samples using appropriate audit procedures, and then he will calculate those different deviation rates, okay, to provide him the basis in forming his audit opinion. Okay, so to continue with our illustration, so since the maximum population deviation rate is 7.8, while our tolerable rate is only 6%. So, what does this indicate? As what we have mentioned, this indicates control risk for control procedure being tested is higher. Therefore, or meaning the risk of material misstatement is high. Okay, because maximum population deviation rate exceeds the tolerable rate. So, what it will be the effect? The scope of substantive procedures will be increased, and your control risk will also be increased. Okay, so that's how audit procedures is used to evaluate the results for the samples taken by the auditor.